The flanged mace in the age of plate armour. Was I completely wrong? Hi folks, Matt Easton here, Schola Gladiatoria. So this is a flanged mace, that is, it has flanges on it. A fairly famous type of weapon. If you go to museums like the Metropolitan Museum of Art or the Wallace Collection or the Tower of London, you will see weapons like this mostly from the 15th and 16th centuries, but the flanged mace did actually come around in the, well, earlier, in the 13th, 14th century really. So I've made a lot of videos in the past talking about different types of weapons such as the flanged mace or indeed the famous war hammer here, which we might refer to later in this video. And I have to say that, you know, you live and you learn. And the fact is that I made certain assumptions about flanged maces based on my limited experience with them. I'm primarily a sword and poleaxe and spear and dagger instructor. I haven't really used maces very much in combat at all because they're not very safe to use. But some people I know have. One of those people who's kind of turned around some of my thinking around the place of maces in the age of plate armour, so we're talking about 14th, 15th, 16th centuries here, is Dequitem, the channel Dequitem, and I'll stick a link below down to his channel. So Leonard over at Dequitem has a lot of armoured fighting experience, and he has experimented with lots of weapons, including these flanged maces, and I've had some interesting discussions with him as well, directly. And the fact is that it has turned me around to looking at the place that flanged maces play in warfare, particularly in the 15th century, because I think that some of the assumptions I had made were actually a little bit wrong. So what I'm going to summarise here is some of my thoughts based on the latest research, discussing with people like Dequitem, and also looking at period artwork from the 15th century, paintings, manuscripts, things like this, and also some written sources as well. Looking at where I think the role of the mace, particularly the flanged mace, is in the 15th century. That is at the height of plate armour and the fully harnessed plate armoured knight. So the very first piece of context I want to set out before going on is that indeed maces have been around since prehistory, far back into prehistory, and in fact if we look at developed maces where you've got a shaft of one material and a head of another material, they were famously used by the Egyptians, for example, and they were issued to infantry, but they were also used by pharaohs and monarchs and stuff like this. So maces, either with a stone head or a metal head, have been around since time immemorial, and definitely they are very effective weapons. I don't want what I set out in this video to give you the impression that the mace is a useless weapon, nobody should ever use it. Within certain contexts, in certain periods, it's an extremely effective weapon. But here's the headline. It doesn't seem to have been a particularly popular or effective weapon in the era of full plate harness. We'll go into why in a second, but we'll also go into, well, why did the flanged mace exist, who used it, and why. So fundamentally those two things. Yes, maces and clubs extremely popular throughout human history and prehistory, but while they were around in the 15th century, they do not seem to have been particularly common weapons, and they don't seem to have been particularly effective. And of course, those two things go hand in hand. So briefly, why weren't they very effective? In a nutshell, Dequitem has set this out very well on his channel, and that is because flanged maces don't do an awful lot. I'm not saying they don't do anything, but they don't do an awful lot against a man who is in full plate harness. And that is a very particular thing. And that's a particular type of armour that only a particular type of person wore. So high-end men-at-arms and knights, really the richest people in society, the top 1%, and they were only around for a relatively small amount of time. So we're talking 14th, 15th, 16th century. So during that period, yes, indeed, maces were used, but for the most part, the one-handed mace is not especially effective against armour, specifically full plate harness. The next important thing, really important thing to say about maces in this period in the 15th century is they were not used instead of swords per se. And I think if you're used to the being exposed to something like maces in something like video games or role-playing games even, or perhaps even movies, then you might think of the mace as an alternative to a sword. But it wasn't. The sword was usually present where a mace was present. So pretty much if we look at medieval art, most people who had something like this 15th century flanged mace also had a sword. Therefore, this is in no sense a weapon which is supposed to supplant or replace a sword. It is a weapon that's used in addition to a sword, for reasons that we're going to look at here. And at the same time, I also want to make clear that the flanged mace was a high status, expensive object. It was something that would cost you as much money as a sword. This isn't a low quality or a cheap, easily obtainable wooden cudgel or studded club. It is a very expensive and difficult to make object, and I know people like Fabrice Cogna who actually make flanged maces, and they are a lot of work. We should also be thinking about things in this context like the poleaxe as well. These are expensive and knightly weapons that cost a lot of money and take a lot of time to make. Therefore, I don't want you to think that the reason that someone might choose to use a mace is because they don't have access to a sword, or because they can't afford a sword or a poleaxe or something like this. That is not the case. The kind of people that used flanged maces were the same people who owned multiple weapons, full plate harness, did own multiple swords in most cases, and did own poleaxes as well. They had these maces for another reason. So as always, when we talk about maces, one of the first things that comes up is the symbology and the status, what they represent. And we know if we go back all the way to the Bayeux Tapestry, the Battle of Hastings, we look at Bishop Odo, and he's carrying a wooden club. And we know throughout history, going all the way back to the Roman era, and in fact going all the way back way beyond that, that batons and maces are indeed a symbol of justice and kingly power, or pharaoh power in case of Egypt. So yes, they had a symbolic purpose, and in fact, so much so if we look at Britain's Parliament or England's Parliament today, you will see they still carry maces with a symbolic purpose. A lot of mayors and people like this also have maces. So generals also carry batons. If you look at even World War II, any of the lead armies, if you look at the German field marshals, for example, they carried batons. So batons, scepters, maces, these are all related objects, and they are symbolic of power. So yes, absolutely, sometimes in medieval art we see someone who is wearing a sword and carrying a mace, and that doesn't mean that they've necessarily chosen to carry the mace because it's more effective than the sword. It could be that rather than carrying a normal general's baton, they're very unlikely to get into combat, and so they might be carrying a mace because you can use it for combat. It's more effective than a baton, but it's also a symbol of who you are. That being said, they can of course also be used as weapons, and in fact some sources do talk about the use of maces as weapons, and we even see them fleetingly in some treatises as well, particularly as we get into the 16th century, interestingly, and we'll come to that a little bit later in this video. So maces absolutely could be used as weapons. Of course, they are still a bludgeoning instrument. You can still smash someone in the helmet, and it should be pointed out that headshots specifically seem to be what these and things like warhammers were mostly about. So yes, absolutely, it is still an effective striking weapon. And in fact, there are some specific peculiarities of the mace which are mentioned in some sources. And in fact, if we go outside Europe and look at Persian sources, they even describe using the mace to break an opponent's sword. Okay, so in some cases this can be used not necessarily because it's more effective at overcoming plate armour, but because it's good at something else specific. And I'd encourage you to think outside the box about what do you think maces would be particularly good at. I know that Dequitem, for example, has suggested they'd be very good at taking prisoners, where you don't want to shank someone through the armpit, for example, because they'd obviously die. Instead, you want to smash them in the helmet such that they are subdued or dazed, and that you're able to grapple them into submission and take them prisoner. So in some cases, yes, absolutely, this could be a weapon of submission, and we know that law enforcement use these, and they become modern police truncheons, incidentally, in the modern world. But think outside of that as well. We know from Persian sources these can break swords, and maybe some other things, other specific uses as well that we haven't yet thought about. But we are starting to get a picture that within armoured fighting, the sword is a more effective weapon in general than the maces. While both can be used against an armoured opponent, and you can win a fight with both weapons, generally speaking, the sword, which is able to stab into gaps, particularly, remember we're talking about the era of full plate harness here, able to stab into eye slits of visors or faces, or into armpits and insides of elbows and around the back of the legs and places like that. This thrusting weapon is, generally speaking, more effective at incapacitating or killing an armoured opponent than the mace is. However, bear in mind also what I said about the fact that the person who has one of these also has a sword, and in fact we do also have some written documentary evidence for the fact that the sword was the preferred first weapon, but this would be a good backup. Why would you need that, you might be asking? Well, simply you've got to remember that within the 15th and 16th centuries, and earlier than that of course, swords didn't always stay in one piece, and we have like colossal amounts of evidence of medieval swords breaking in use. Why would they break in use? Well, first of all, their steel wasn't as good as ours, their heat treatment wasn't as scientific as ours, but secondly, they're smashing them against people in armour. And if you're repeatedly taking, it doesn't matter even if it's a modern, great quality sharp sword, and repeatedly smashing it into hardened steel or iron armour, it's going to get broken at some point. It's going to get damaged at least, and there's a good chance it will get broken. So swords broke in use. If your sword breaks, what are you supposed to do? Have one of these! So these were carried as backups to sword, particularly in a cavalry environment. And of course, sometimes you might even drop the sword. So having a backup weapon is always useful. And one of the great things about a mace is it's almost impossible to break. So while a sword might be great because it's got edges and a point, it's far easier to break than a mace is. So as a last-ditch weapon, for a striking weapon anyway, obviously you've got your dagger as well, but as a last-ditch striking weapon, a mace is a pretty reliable last-ditch weapon. Even if it's not as good as a sword, you know it's not going to break on you. Now, I've mentioned cavalry a few times, and I want to be absolutely categorically clear with you on one thing in this video, and that is that these maces seem to be almost, if not 100%, almost exclusively related to mounted use, that is, cavalry. So these were backup weapons for mounted men. So indeed, their first weapon would usually be a lance, their second weapon would usually be a sword, and their backup weapon, or perhaps sometimes by choice for some specific reason, might be a mace. Now, these weren't universally carried by cavalry. There were some cavalry who always had maces as backup. The Turks often had maces. The Polish copied them, so Janissaries had them in the Ottoman Empire. Also, the Mamluks often carried maces, the Persians often carried maces, the Indians often carried maces later on. So these were often backup weapons for cavalry after their primary or secondary weapons were expended, or for specific purposes, and we'll get into that in a second. But I want you to remember that this short mace is almost entirely, doesn't matter whether you're looking at the Islamic world or India or Europe, is almost exclusively seen as a cavalry weapon, much like, incidentally, the short warhammer is as well. In contrast, if you're fighting on foot, certainly if you're fighting in full plate harness, then of course you'd have a weapon with greater leverage and greater reach, like the poleaxe. So in many ways, this is the infantryman's mace. It does all of the things, well, it's everything really. It's a spear, it's an axe, it's a hammer, it's all of those things, and it's got two ends as well. So fighting on foot, things like the poleaxe and the glaive dominated. The mace is really a horseman's weapon. But why is it a horseman's weapon, I hear you ask? Well, so combining some of the points we've made here, if this is your secondary weapon after the lance is broken or stuck into an opponent, then if this breaks or this gets knocked out of your gauntleted hand, this is a useful thing to have as a backup. Moreover, this is something that can hang via a ring on the side of your saddlebow on your horse. If you're fighting on foot, you can't easily carry one of these as a backup. Okay, so we sometimes see people on foot holding these in their hand, probably for symbolic reasons to represent who they are. But generally speaking, you'd have a poleaxe or a spear or a glaive in your hand and a sword at your side and a dagger on the other side. You don't have any space to be walking around having a mace hanging off your belt, and it's not a very convenient thing to walk around with. So these are great hanging off a saddlebow. The horse takes the weight, you don't have to worry about carrying it, firstly. Secondly, almost indestructible. Therefore, if your sword breaks, really good backup. Also, the mace on horseback, being relatively short while you're holding the reins of the horse, is fairly easy to use. You're less likely to hit your own horse with it. But in addition to that, in terms of the power it offers, so you will notice, of course, that a mace is balanced towards the head. Okay, so the point of balance is here, unlike a sword, which is balanced towards your hand. That means it can hit with quite a lot of momentum. But now consider you're sitting on a horse. Two important things about sitting on a horse, as my friend Zach Evans will tell you. Firstly, height. If you are striking with a mace on an infantryman who's below you, you have the additional momentum of gravity behind here. So if you're striking downwards, especially if you stand up and then dropping your saddle down, you've got the additional force, as well as that mass and the balance of it and your arm, you've got the additional force of gravity going down because you're above them. But if you're striking another cavalryman, then you've got momentum of speed as well. So mass times velocity. If you're going along, smack, with a heavy object on the end of a short shaft that you can keep a good handle on, you can hit with an awful lot of force with one of these from horseback, added to the speed of your horse, which is not a factor that you have on foot. On foot, these are not particularly powerful weapons, not particularly effective weapons against plate armour, but on horseback, a lot of things change because of the power of the horse. Now, specifically in the context of the 15th and 16th centuries, you could say the 14th as well, actually, there's another thing to think about. When you're fighting on horseback, and we've already established this is predominantly a cavalry weapon, not only is the opponent, if you're just fighting one-on-one or you happen to be fighting one person at that moment, not only is the opponent a valid target, but of course, the horse is a valid target as well. And we see this, for example, in Fiore or Talhofer, particularly in Fiore. Pretty much one of his first lessons is to target the horse instead of targeting the rider. In that case, it's with a lance, but he also does it with a sword. He doesn't show maces, but absolutely you could use a mace. Now, horses at this time weren't always armoured, but they were sometimes armoured. Now, I offer you this. Against a large, meaty, muscly creature like a horse, swords are designed to be extremely effective against human-sized targets. They're not extremely effective against horse-sized targets. In fact, we know, obviously, spears of various kinds and lances are effective against horses, swords not so much. So against a horse, bearing in mind you're not necessarily aiming to kill the horse with one blow or anything like that, but you're aiming to discombobulate the horse, so to put it off fighting and to make it harder to control for the rider. In that context, perhaps maces, and I don't know any written evidence for this, perhaps maces smacked into a horse's head have more effect than a sword thrust or a sword cut would. And of course, if the horse is wearing a chanfron and it's wearing other armour, then perhaps the mace is more effective at putting the horse off the fight than a sword would be. So I hope all of this information comes together to give you a different way of looking at the mace, particularly in the 15th century, perhaps even 14th century as well, than perhaps simply going, oh, well, it's a top-heavy weapon and you break armour with it and it hurts the person through the armour. It turns out it doesn't really. Most plate armour is able to withstand the blows of maces really, really very well. And in fact, you are at greater risk in full plate harness against someone with a sharp pointy sword jamming it in the gaps than you are from someone just bashing you with their mace. The fact is that armour is designed to be bashed. I mean, you can do poleaxe fighting. It's designed to be bashed with really quite heavy objects and you to be more or less okay. You might get some bruises, you might be a bit battered around, but fundamentally you'll survive. The dagger or the sword stabbing between plates and into gaps and into the eyes and stuff like that is more of a mortal danger to you than being hit with a mace, even on a helmet, okay? However, taking all of the things I've just said about it being useful as a backup weapon, it may be being effective, much more appropriate on horseback and a good backup weapon on there, potentially being able to break other people's blades, potentially being useful against people's horses when they're riding, and really being a cavalry weapon. Remember, on foot, you're usually going to have something like a poleaxe or a longer weapon. It doesn't suit really as a foot weapon at all with these proportions. However, there's another factor I haven't mentioned so far, and that is historical context. So we see maces being used particularly in medieval and early Renaissance art in areas where they were fighting opponents who weren't necessarily European knights. Now, if we just look around the world and see where else were maces popular at this time, we have the North African Mamluks, we have the Persians, we have the Ottoman Turks, we have Indians. So these are people who were using many of the similar weapons to we were using in medieval Europe, but they weren't wearing plate armour. And here's the thing. I'm coming to the conclusion that while this might have symbolic meaning in late medieval Europe and all sorts of other useful sort of facets to its existence, fundamentally, if we look at the big picture, the short horseman's mace is really something that was popular in areas where they didn't have plate armour or didn't have hardly any plate armour. I'm not saying it didn't exist at all, but very, very little of it. In other words, the opponents were only wearing a helmet and mail, or sometimes lamella. The Mamluks used maces as well, incidentally. So if you have lamella or mail, here's the thing. If you strike a breastplate or a pauldron with a mace, it doesn't do anything really at all. However, if you strike someone who's wearing mail or lamella, then the force transmits through there in a far more effective way than the bridge or arch formed by hard plate armour. So, European plate harness perfectly adapted to receiving blows with the mace. However, if you are a German knight and you might be fighting some Tatars or you might be fighting some Ottoman Turks, then a mace might be really useful now, because do you know what mail armour and lamella is really good for protecting against? It's really good for protecting against cuts. That's exactly what it was designed to do. It's not fantastic against thrusts, but fundamentally, one of the great things about a mace on someone wearing mail or lamella is you can smash them anywhere and you stand a pretty good chance of breaking their collarbone or their shoulder or their arm bone, their forearm bone, or their ribs, you know, whichever bit, their sternum, whichever bit of them you hit, so long as they're only wearing mail with a relatively thin, historically, layer of padding underneath, perhaps even just layers of clothing underneath, or lamella, you stand a better chance of having a immediately disabling effect with a mace against one of those opponents than you do a European knight. And within Europe as well, as we go into the 16th century, thanks to gunpowder and artillery and various other things happening on the battlefield and large pike blocks and things like this, there are fewer people wearing heavy armour, if we call it that. So yes, knights still existed, yes, heavy cavalry was still a thing, but the majority of infantry, if you look at a standard Landsknecht, for example, is wearing less armour in, say, 1520, 1530 than most billmen were wearing in 1470. Okay, they are wearing on average less armour, a lot of soldiers anyway, by this point, and therefore the mace starts to become popular and effective again. And we do see a lot of maces, a lot of flanged maces in museums are 16th century, they're not 15th century. The number of 15th century flanged maces in art is really quite rare. We start to see it more as we get towards the end of the 15th century and into the 16th century, and specifically in certain parts of Europe where the battlefield conditions perhaps favoured it and made it more appropriate for cavalry, remember, not for foot soldiers. So there we go. I hope that's given you lots to think about. Thanks again to Dequitem for all of his thoughts on this topic, because I have to be honest, I had accepted the standard narrative around maces in the past, and I think what we're looking at now is a far more informed and nuanced, and I have to say, I think more realistic and believable narrative as to why the flanged mace existed and why some people chose to carry them, even if they weren't ever hugely popular. Thanks a lot for watching. I have been Matt Easton. Of course, I will be again next time as well. Hopefully you're subscribed. If you're not, remember to click that button. Please give me a like if you've enjoyed this video, and I really hope I'll see you back on the channel soon. Cheers, folks. Thanks for watching. We've got extra videos on Patreon. Please give our Facebook a like and subscribe if you haven't already. Cheers, folks.